So we're really, really lucky to have Ross Goldingay from Southern Cross University tonight. Ross is a bit of a glider guru, so we're really excited to hear what he's got to share with us tonight. And he's going to present on some research conducted near Bendigo over a 6-year period, monitoring nest boxes that were installed in a block of forest that was really lacking in natural tree hollows. So I think this study will provide some really good insights for a lot of the work that hopefully all of you in the audience are doing as well, and spark some interest there. So over to you, Ross.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm coming to you from Bundjalung country in northeast New South Wales. Now, I'll like to acknowledge all the elders, past, present, and emerging. Yes, this is the talk I'm going to present. I should highlight here, this is a photo of me about 15 years ago, so I've aged a little bit since then. Now, this is where we're going tonight in this seminar. I'm going to cover these items here. I will get to the Bendigo project towards the end, but I feel compelled to provide a fair bit of background about nest boxes and artificial hollows, just to give you a good understanding of sort of, I guess, what we've come to learn over the last 20 or 30 years. So a good place to start is just to define what an artificial hollow is. I'm sort of using that word as a broader term to sort of encompass a few different things, but basically it encompasses nest boxes, chainsaw carved hollows, and drilled hollows. And even I'm using nest box in a fairly loose way here, in that it covers what we might consider a typical nest box, which is a timber box with a lid on it, but it can also include PVC tubes that are capped at each end, and that might be a sort of a reasonable size box, or it could be, as in a study I've done on eastern pygmy possums, where I used these little narrow tubes which have about a 4 centimetre diameter, and they were used quite frequently. But I can also consider things as nest boxes that might be like a spout hollow in that photo there from the second from the right. And then on the right-hand side, there's Darren Quin inspecting a nest box that is really what we would call a log hollow. So basically a hollow log, hollow branch that's been capped at one end. There's been other studies done where they might sort of cap it at both ends and install it some way and cut an entrance hollow into it. So there's a whole range of things that we could refer to as nest boxes, and they could be made of a variety of materials. And I'll come to this in a moment, but nest boxes have been around for quite some time. Okay, chainsaw carved hollows. As the name suggests, you basically get a chainsaw and cut a cavity into a tree, and then you basically need to cover up the entrance to that cavity. So you could do that by just, I guess, carefully cutting a faceplate just prior to when you cut the cavity, or you might actually have some pieces of dry timber that you've prepared in advance. And in that study by Steve Griffiths and his colleagues, they installed their face plates where they created a gap at the top, which was the entrance hole. Whereas in that photo to the right there, William Terry, in his study, he had the entrance hole sort of drilled into the faceplate. And those faceplates are permanently attached using screws. Now, the drilled hollow, there's a couple of different types of this. A friend of mine, Murray Ellis, came up with this idea a number of years ago, where he recognised that a lot of trees can actually have what you might call an internal void or a cavity. And they don't necessarily need to be huge trees, but they're basically trees that have, for whatever reason, they've got a void in the middle. But perhaps they're not old enough or weathered enough that they haven't sort of had branches break off or dead wood break off that's opened up an entrance into that cavity. So what Murray did was he could go out and drill these little small sort of 1 centimetre diameter exploratory drill holes into trees to detect the internal void. And if he detected some, he then drilled a larger entrance of, I don't know, 50 to 90 mils to provide an entrance for animals to use it. There's also, you may have also encountered another type of drilled hollow, which is using a device called a hollow hog. So there's a guy in New South Wales, Matt Stevens, that invented this device. So it's basically like an auger that fits onto a drill, and I guess he connects his drills up to a generator or whatever. But it's got this device on the end that will drill a hole in to and I guess the typical sort of diameter is about 50 mils. And then when it goes in, it sort of can open up, can cut open a cavity. It's got a bit, I think it's got a bit of a constraint to it in terms of how you can maneuver it once it gets inside the tree, but it does allow you to create a cavity inside past the entrance hole. Now, a lot of those drilled hollows have been put in, but Murray Ellis's study is the only one that's been published to date. Now, I want to sort of add this caveat here that I don't have any specific preference for nest boxes over other types of artificial hollows. It's just that there has been a long history of people installing nest boxes, and I've been doing studies on nest boxes for about 25 years now. And there are people out there advocating that, drilled hollows or carved hollows are better for various reasons. But because those artificial hollows are still relatively new, we're still trying to understand the sort of management requirements that might be associated with those sorts of artificial hollows. I think people could be delusional to think that, you can just install these things and there's not going to be any maintenance issues. And certainly with William Terry's work, we've found that there are issues where the tree starts to grow over the faceplate. If you don't put the cavity in the right spot on the tree, they can fill up with water. So there are a few issues that still need to be addressed. Now, a couple of points I would make about nest boxes from a research point of view, at least, is that they do provide a fair bit of flexibility. So if you want to sort of move them around, which I have in my pygmy possum study, where I've actually added nest boxes and then taken them away from certain plots. But also a key element of the work I've done is that I like to sort of catch the animals in the boxes so I can, I guess, examine them and work out what their age and sex classes are, and also mark them so that when you do this repeatedly, you get get information about recaptures, which can be important. Whereas the studies, all the studies so far that have involved the chainsaw hollows have had those permanent face plates attached, and the studies are relying on using, say, pole cameras to basically just detect presence or absence of the animals inside the hollows. So that is a bit of a constraint from a research point of view. Okay, why are artificial tree hollows needed? Well, in Australia, we have more than 200 species of vertebrate wildlife that require hollows for breeding and or shelter. And across Australia, in our various woodland and forested ecosystems, I guess we've had a bit of a terrible history, I guess, of decimating the hollow resources in those ecosystems. And this has come about due to historic clearing, excessive logging, mining, road building, urbanisation, and then wildfires can have an impact as well. But I should highlight with wildfires that it depends on the site itself and the tree species. So wildfires can actually create hollows as well as remove hollows. So don't just assume if a wildfire goes through an area that it's actually, may have stripped an area of usable hollows, because that may not be the case. Now, it's also worth noting that while we might be sort of emphasising or focusing on species that have lost out in terms of not having enough tree hollows to access, there's certainly a lot of hollow using species that do have an adequate supply. So you might have seen lots of rainbow lorikeets and lots of white cockatoos and corellas. Those parrots are certainly finding adequate supplies of hollows across the landscapes where they occur. But there are a number of species that are either in decline or they're being held back because of our depletion of the tree hollow resource. Now, to give you a bit of a quick potted history, with some students of mine, we published some papers 15 to 20 years ago now. It's a bit hard to believe, but we reviewed what had been done in terms of nest boxes and marsupials, and also birds and bats in terms of nest boxes, and also what we might call bat boxes rather than referring to those as nest boxes. Now, there's only a couple of points I want to make from these graphs, so I don't want to put you off too much, but the graphs are divided into 5-year timeframes up until the paper was written, so it covers about a 25-year period. Now, the black bars, or the height of the bars, show how many papers were published in that period, so it sort of shows there's been an increase. So the first studies were basically published in the, were started in the mid to late 70s and then published in the early 80s. And I should point out that in the US and in Europe, there's a much longer history of installation of nest boxes. There are places where there's been nest boxes in place for over 100 years. And there's also a much longer history of using those the carved hollows and the drilled hollows. So they've got decades of experience with those. But anyway, the number of studies that have been conducted in Australia was sort of increasing. And the black bars indicate that the research studies, and the other coloured bars, certainly in terms of the graph on the left, represent the sort of what you might call the management-related studies involving nest boxes. On the right, the grey bars indicate the bat boxes, and the white bars, the management-related studies on birds. So I guess the point there is that there hadn't been a lot of management-related studies at the time when we wrote these papers, and we were sort of making recommendations about how we could move forward with using nest boxes and other types of artificial cavities to manage our hollow-using species. And I guess we also made the point that there's still room for a lot more research to be done. Now, prior to publishing those papers, this particular study came out here in 2001, and this sort of sparked a bit of a what you might call a bit of a controversy, in that it was basically looking at the economics of conducting a nest box program for an endangered species, and the endangered species in question happened to be leadbeater's possum. And you might notice Dan Harley's name there if you're familiar with Dan and his work on leadbeater's possums. So this became a bit controversial, that the critics of this sort of idea were concerned that if nest boxes could be used to manage any species like leadbeater's possum, then it could provide arguments for, I guess, forest industries to just put up nest boxes and not worry about retaining old growth trees, which we definitely do need to retain. So it provoked a few different additional studies where people were sort of arguing backward and forward about the merits. But it sort of, I think to some extent, prevented people moving forward with actually using nest boxes as a management tool. So over the period after the review papers, with my students, we started doing additional research to try and fill in some of the knowledge gaps, and particularly around nest box design, because that was a key point that was sort of holding some of this work back, I think. Okay, and because of the studies that came out to critique that idea, I published a paper with some colleagues in 2020 where some of these critiques had been around for a while, and I decided to sort of put them together in what I refer to as nest box contentions. And then we also assembled a new and I guess original data set to interrogate these particular contentions. So there's 5 contentions. The first is that the nest boxes mostly benefit common species. Exotic species can be dominant users of nest boxes. The third one is that species of conservation concern maybe or often are infrequent users of nest boxes. The fourth one is that nest boxes have high rates of attrition. And then the last one, which sort of came up a bit later after those other ones, was that recognition that nest boxes, the temperatures in nest boxes tend to track ambient temperature. And during the summer, when temperatures can get quite hot, they can even go above ambient. So people were then concerned that animals using nest boxes might be, adversely affected by that. And there's certainly some evidence from the Northern Hemisphere of birds and bats having mortality events associated with being in boxes. Okay, so let's look at the first issue, the first contention relating to common species. So I've highlighted the studies here that were really presenting the data to support this particular contention. And what the graph shows, so across the x-axis are the various species that were detected in these 3 studies. And I've put a red circle around the brush-tailed possum data. So it shows that the brush-tailed possum was a common user of those nest boxes. So that sort of ticks that box. That's certainly a realistic finding. And I've got one of my photos down here, and I'm using that to sort of highlight the issue of the entrance size of that particular box. So once you've got a nest box with an entrance of about 9 centimeters or above, suddenly that box becomes fair game for brush-tailed possums. And when you look at these 3 studies, across the 3 studies, like a third or even close to 2/3 of the boxes that were installed were what I would call possum boxes because of the entrance sizes. So to me, it's not surprising if you're putting up possum boxes that you're going to get a lot of possums in those boxes. So in this study of ours, we were able to collect some original data to address this issue about nest box design, or certainly the issue relating to entrance size. So I had been contracted by the New South Wales Road Agency to collate data from a whole bunch of nest box projects that they had paid consultants to conduct over a number of years. And within that data set, there was 1,865 nest boxes, and there was basically 16 projects. So it was a very large data set. And in those projects, they typically installed about 8 different nest box designs. And the nest box designs are listed there. They had names, but the key point was that they had different entrance sizes. So the scan dot is scanned saurian mammals. They had the idea of using that as the name for their small design. But the point here is that you'll see there's a possum box with an entrance size of 8.5 to 10 centimeters, and then there's some for owls and large parrots. And when you look at the percentage of boxes that were used by brushtails, so those 4 larger ones, you'll see there's a fairly high rate of use of about 30% or even a bit above that. And those boxes accounted for about 28% of all the boxes installed. So it gives you this idea that, okay, the common brushtail is one of these common species that maybe we don't want to be catering for, but they're going to be there if you're putting up boxes that you might call it something else like a large parrot box, but you're going to be encountering a lot of brushtails in that sort of box. But luckily in this study, they also installed these smaller entrance size boxes. So it gives us a way of seeing what was using those. So a lot of the studies were using pole cameras to check what was in the boxes. So often they couldn't distinguish between whether they had sugar gliders or squirrel gliders. But certainly 12 of the 16 projects did definitively identify at least some squirrel gliders in their boxes. But what the graph shows is that the small glider box, which had the 4 to 4.5 centimeter entrance, was the most attractive to the small gliders. So I guess a bit under 40% of those, you would see gliders in them, but more than 60% showed evidence of use based on seeing nests there as well. So it highlights this point that there's competitive interactions between animals that are using tree hollows and nest boxes, and typically the smaller animals will be choosing entrances into their hollows or nest boxes that are a fairly tight fit or a neat fit for their body size. So if you look at the photo on the right, that's one of mine from my work on yellow-bellied gliders. And it always amazed me, and I've seen the same thing with squirrel gliders, that when you see them going into their den trees, they often have to really squeeze into the entrance. So this animal here actually had to sort of stick its legs out parallel with its tail to actually get inside that entrance there. And you can see that photo of the feather-tailed glider there. So we did a study where we looked at providing different box designs, and we had a narrow entrance design to target the feather-tail. But one of the boxes we installed had a larger entrance size that was suitable for squirrel gliders. And across 5 different sites, or 4 sites where we had squirrel gliders, we did not get feather-tails using that larger entrance size because they were trying to avoid, I guess, being beaten up by larger animals. So that's a common finding, that you've really got to target. You've got to think about the entrance size of your target species in terms of what your box design is. And to some extent, the size, the dimensions of the box itself are not so critical, but obviously you've got to have a box that's big enough to contain at least one individual. And if you've got group living species, you need a box big enough that's going to be able to contain a group. Now, in terms of whether nest boxes are attractive or are used mostly by introduced species, so here are the data from the 1,865 nest boxes. So less than 1% were used by black rats, less than 1% used by minor and starling birds, 9% showed evidence of use by bees. So often people are concerned about feral bees colonising hives and taking them over. And certainly in the early days of some of the work we were doing in Brisbane, this did become a concern. When we got bees, we then spent a bit of time trying to get rid of them. But after a couple of years, we realised that things like putting carpet on the underside of lids doesn't actually work. But we realised that small volume boxes, and typically the boxes that we were using, so it's only if you've got a really large, say, big parrot box or whatever, that's going to have enough capacity for a beehive to sort of maintain itself over multiple years, whereas the smaller volume boxes, basically the bees will fill that, and then after 12 months, there's just sort of no more space, and they basically swarm and then move on somewhere else. And then basically the gliders or the antichinuses move in and clean up all the honeycomb. So in that big study we did, only 1% of all the boxes actually had active hives in. So it just highlights that those exotic species are not an issue. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about, threatened species and using various kinds of nest boxes, but there isn't time to do that. And I'll just highlight that a whole bunch of endangered species have been shown to be using boxes at a very high rate. And for some of these studies, like with the Gouldian finch and the black cockatoos, there is really good evidence that those box programs are actually sustaining or supporting populations of those species. The study on the southern greater glider, that's just one that's come out in the last couple of months, but it was showing high levels of use by those greater gliders. So I would predict that you would be able to support populations of greater gliders with nest boxes. Okay, now I'll start talking about Bendigo nest boxes because this highlights this issue. The thing you can't see on the top of the screen here is looking at the issue of nest box attrition. So BioLinks actually had a nest box symposium back in 2015 in Seymour, and I presented at that. And Karen Thomas was at that symposium, and she came up to me after my talk and told me about the fact that the Bendigo field nats had installed nest boxes at various locations around Bendigo, and she wanted some advice about what she could do with those old box studies. So we devised this project where she basically went out and did an audit of all these boxes that had been installed, and then spoke to the people, the blokes that had put them up, and got information about how long these boxes had been up there. And then we did some analysis to look at this whole issue of nest box attrition. So basically, boxes that had been up for 10 years, 80% of them were still functional. We came up with a definition of what functional looked like. Clearly, the box had to have a lid on, had to be, basically you could look at it and it could be usable. And a lot of them did actually have nests and animals in them. some of the boxes had been up for 18 years, 60% of those are still functional. Now, with the boxes that have been up for 25 years, the thing that astounded me was that those boxes hadn't been looked at or maintained for 15 years, and still there was about 25% of them were functional. So this whole idea that you need high rates of maintenance, like several times a year or even once a year, to keep box programs going is just completely untrue. And I've done a number of studies now, and you can get by with fairly minor maintenance each year if you are checking your boxes each year. And one of the intriguing things is when you look at the northern hemisphere studies that have been going for 50 or even up to 100 years, they don't actually talk about maintenance, so it's not actually an issue for them, which is quite surprising. One of the other key findings that came out of this study was that we looked at, I did various analyses, including to look at the influence of the way the boxes were attached to trees. And we found that those boxes that were hung on a nail actually were 5 times more likely to be functional than those that were nailed directly to the tree. And what's going on there is that trees grow and expand over time. And if you nail your boxes directly to the tree's just going to be pulling at that box and will basically split the box at some point. It'll either knock it off the nail, push it forward, or it may actually pull it apart because it's sort of pulling on the nails that might be there. So that's a key finding. And I mean, prior to that, the very first nest box study I ever did, I hung the boxes on large decking spikes. Now, this is the fifth contention, which is this idea about the temperatures in nest boxes could be detrimental to the animals that are using the boxes. Now, in the lower graph here from a study I've done in Brisbane, what it's showing is basically it's just ambient temperature is shown by the thick black line. The upper lines are the maximum daily temperature. The lower line is the minimum temperature. The fine line and the dotted line are sets of boxes that I put up. I was looking at whether if you put boxes on the southeast side of a tree where the shade later in the day compared to the northwest boxes that might be more likely to be in sunny positions. And there was some sense of that the boxes that were in the shady area sort of tracked closer to ambient, didn't go above ambient. Now on the right, I've presented data from or a graph from a study by Steve Griffiths with chainsaw hollows. And he's in this graph, he's done a lot of monitoring over multiple days of temperatures in natural tree hollows, chainsaw hollows, log hollows, and also nest boxes. And it's sort of highlighting what we know, what we've found since then and since before then, which is that the nest box temperatures, the maximum will often go above ambient, and also that the carved hollows, which are carved into the trunks of the tree, and therefore they're what I refer to as trunk hollows, they're actually basically mimicking what you might record in a natural tree hollow if it's a trunk hollow. One of the things that's not sort of recognised in some of these studies that are looking at temperatures is that a lot of animals are actually using branch hires. So branches actually have a lot less insulation of either the living or the dead part of the tree around the cavity compared to, say, within the trunk of a tree. And often within the trunk of the tree, you've got live bark, and there's suggestions in the literature that having sap flowing up and down in that live bark is actually providing a cooling effect. So anyway, I'll move on to some other studies that we've done, because these studies are somewhat, let's say, theoretical, because a lot of them have been done without looking at animals in the boxes. Mine actually had animals in the boxes there. So you might say, well, what's actually the effect on animals using boxes? So this brings in the Bendigo study again. So we started setting this up fully in 2018, and then you might recall that there was a drought in Victoria during, and also in New South Wales between 2018 and 2019. So we were monitoring our boxes twice per year, but particularly in May, and we had Phascogales and sugar gliders in our boxes. So and over the summer between these 2 years, we had 10 days where the temperature went at or above 40 degrees, and there was one day in January when it exceeded 45 degrees. So you would think that would provide a very good test of whether animals using boxes were going to be harmed by being in those boxes over the hot summer. So you would expect to see a decline in the number of animals you detect the following May. But if I move to that, we didn't actually see that, if anything. So the grey bars are showing the numbers, whereas the black bars are showing the number of boxes occupied. There wasn't much difference between the number of boxes occupied, and with the Phascogales, the numbers actually increased a little bit. Now, another way to look at this is to do multi-year mark recapture studies, and this has been done for squirrel gliders. So I've done this, and it wasn't designed to test this out when it was actually done, but it provided this insight sort of retrospectively. So we could look at, so when you do these mark recapture studies, and if it's done over a set of years, you can actually do a detailed analysis to estimate the probability of survival of the species that you've been tagging. And in this case, it was squirrel gliders. So there was a data set from Kylie Soanes where she had done mark recapture of squirrel gliders where they only had access to tree hollows. And I had done 2 other studies with colleagues, one where in Brisbane where the gliders had access to nest boxes and tree hollows, and then another one at the back of the Sunshine Coast where the gliders only had access to nest boxes. So you would predict that survival rates of the animals using the nest boxes would be lower than those that were relying on tree hollows. But this is what comes out of those analyses. And the interesting thing to me is that the nest box study I did actually covered a 10-year period, and we actually had squirrel gliders residing in those boxes for like 6 and 8 years. It was quite phenomenal. So there was no apparent influence, and you wouldn't be saying that Brisbane or the back of the Sunshine Coast is necessarily, cool climate environments where, the animals are not subjected to, the vagaries of the summer temperatures. Okay, so I sort of think we can reject all of these contentions. I would add a few caveats around the issue of extreme temperatures, because as I say, there are some observations of mortality events in North America, and I think I'm trying to remember, I think Steve Griffiths has also documented some bats dying in bat boxes. So we do need to keep an eye on that. And I should point out that there has been a lot of other research done looking at painting boxes in different colours. So boxes painted white often will have lower temperatures, and you can put various kinds of insulation around boxes, which will also provide insulation and reduce temperatures. So there are a few ways of dealing with that. Now, to move on to the full Bendigo study. So these photos give you a bit of a sense of the habitat there. There's a long history of, cutting of the trees in the forest. It's being around Bendigo, it's subjected to gold mining. So there's a lot of tree cutting associated with that. And there's probably been a long history of tree cutting for fence posts and for firewood and so on. So when you go in there, the forest really is dominated by small stem trees. And it's also interesting that when you look at these trees closely, you see that the trees have often been cut sort of low to the ground, but not necessarily right at the ground. So there's often dead wood. So you can see that the trees are actually, the individual tree itself could be quite old, because you've got this larger base, and the base can have dead parts to it, dead stumps and so on, and those stumps have hollows in, and they can be used by hollow using animals, but often the hollows are actually vertical and they're narrow and they're not very big. And Darren, Quin and I have actually collected detailed data on the hollows through the forest by also, coming up with some definitions of what we would see as a hollow that would be, the size and so on that needs to be suitable for, say, a single sugar glider or a single Phascogale, and also how big it would need to be suitable to a breeding female Phascogale. Now, these are the specs for this study. So we had sort of two areas, but this is the main area at Diamond Hill. It's sort of surrounded by cleared land to the west and the south, and then there's a major arterial road that goes around the east and the north. So it's not completely cut off, but we can view it as sort of a bit of a single block of 600 hectares of forest. Now, because there was a history to the way the nest boxes were installed, the distribution of the nest boxes along the tracks and so on through the forest has been a little bit sort of, let's say, ad hoc. But basically, based on the way they've been distributed, I've sort of thrown circles around those and then identified, put them into what I would call 75 sites or clusters, and the clusters have various numbers of boxes. And the clusters could be as close as 100 metres or up to about 300 metres apart. And we started with about 135 boxes, and it's gone up to about 163 at the end in the 6th year. And we checked the boxes twice a year. And as I say, there were a few natural hollows of any quality. And these were our targets. The original work, when the older field gnats put the boxes up, they were targeting brush-tailed Phascogales. So it's been sort of a long-term sort of species of interest and concern. But the entrance sizes that are suitable for Phascogales are also suitable for sugar gliders. And certainly sugar gliders are a worthy species to try and support in our forest ecosystems. I should highlight that this sugar glider has now been identified as a different species, so it's what I refer to as the inland sugar glider. Now, another little bit of context with this work. So there was a drought at the beginning of the study in 2018 and 19, and then that was followed by 3 years of above average rainfall. So that's sort of interesting in terms of, I would predict that there's going to be an effect of that on the animals in the forest. And that could explain why early on in the first couple of years, we sort of had lower numbers. Whenever you start a nest box study, it does take time for animals to build up their numbers. Animals will find these boxes straight away, but it may depend on how big the sort of remnant population might be in the area that you're putting the boxes in. And then once they have these better breeding sites, they then will need, they've then got to be able to increase in numbers. So what we saw early on, so to some extent, we also had fewer boxes. So the lower numbers in the first couple of years, the drought effect, the new good boxes added, and also fewer boxes. And then over time, with those better rainfall years, just provided amazing, breeding years for animals to really pump through their offspring. And it amazed me in that last census in October 2023, over 300 sugar gliders, and that included adults and subadults and nestlings. Now, the Phascogale numbers. So the Phascogale is a bigger animal, about 250 grams, so twice the size at least, to the sugar gliders, and they also are territorial. So they have a much bigger area that they require to obtain their food from. So you're never going to see the same sort of numbers. But even so, the numbers we got early on was quite intriguing, that we had high numbers. So just be clear that the May surveys, we had males present, but the males die after about 11 months. So the October surveys, you only have females present, and then they may have pouch young at that time or soon after that. So what it shows, that I think in 2020 there was a bit of a drought effect there, so that's why the numbers are still low there, and then they've sort of jumped up after that. So by the end of it, we had something like 26 breeding females in that last survey. So to me, that was pretty impressive. So the question then is, are we supporting, much of a population of gliders and Phascogales in this forest? So how do we work that out? So I'm just making some very basic, simple assumptions here. So our block of forest is 600 hectares. We can dive into the animal literature to find out how big a core area Phascogales need. And Todd Soderquist did a lot of great work in the 90s. And that shows that female Phascogales need about 15 hectares, and they're territorial, so that will be exclusive. Sugar gliders, I've relied on Graham Suckling's work here, and that's based on a trapping study rather than a radio tracking study. So that number could be a little bit on the low side, but I've just used 2 hectares. So if we just divide those numbers into the 600 hectares, if the whole area is suitable, and we're certainly getting high numbers all the way through where our boxes are, it does appear that the whole area is pretty much suitable. But if there was tree hollows all the way through that were suitable for these animals, then you might estimate you could fit 300 glider groups, but I think that is probably an overestimate. But you could also fit 40 breeding female Phascogales in there. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at what we actually had at the end of our study, so we had 18% of 300 glider groups and 65% of the breeding female Phascogales that could potentially be contained within that broader forest. Now, I think that we know that there are some other suitable hollows, natural hollows through the forest, but I think we're probably for both species, well, certainly for the Phascogale, I think we're probably up around 80% we're supporting in our nest boxes, whereas with the sugar gliders, I suspect we could be supporting 50%, at least 50% of what what is in that forest, but just based on our nest boxes. And the nest boxes are used all the time, so it's not as if these animals are moving. They do move. That's not to say they don't move between tree hollows and the nest boxes, but they are relying on our nest boxes because they're in those boxes all the time, and we haven't really seen any difference in use over that period apart from an increase, and certainly not much difference between May and October. And the sugar gliders have had large groups in those boxes in both periods of the year, and certainly in the October period, which follows the sort of seasonal breeding they have in spring, large numbers of subadults. And the females, we do get some of the gliders out of the boxes. A lot of those most of those females actually had pouch young. So lots of breeding is happening. So the conclusion I would draw is that artificials can restore habitat value for various species, and we know that from other work that's being done on birds and so on. But we have done a lot of work during this study over the last 6 years, and also previously over the last 20 or 25 years. So our knowledge really has increased. So we're in a much better space now to be able to use artificial hollows to try and manage our hollow using species. But conducting further studies will even improve this knowledge further. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Ross. We will quickly get into some questions. First question was from Ella, 6 years old, is wondering, how do the animals protect their hollows when they go to find food?
How do they protect them? Generally, they don't protect them because these two mammals that we've been focusing on, the Phascogales and the gliders, typically the tree hollows would be in the core area of their home ranges, so they won't be too far away. Even though 15 hectares is a fairly big area for a Phascogale, they will defend that area. So they've already spent time leading up to when they're breeding, defending that area and keeping others out. So they do defend them. Whereas with sugar gliders, because there's a social group, they won't be too far away, and they can move fairly quickly because they're gliding, so they can get back to there. But there will be issues. There will be competition with other individuals of the same species from time to time, and even with other species. But that's just what these animals have to deal with, whether it's nest boxes or whether it's tree hollows.
Yeah, great. Interesting question from Janet, wondering if you're removing an animal from a nest box for data collection for that individual animal and put it back. Have you monitored what happens? Is the animal stressed? It doesn't return to that box? Does it go and use a different box or hollow? That sort of safety feeling.
Yes, good question. There's a few different answers to that. The interesting thing with the Phascogales, before I started this study, I'd only ever handled a few Phascogales. So the thing that amazes me is that you pull them out of the box. It's a big animal. It can give you a nasty bite, but you put it back in and they just tuck into, because they build a nest, particularly with the breeding females. They have a nest made out of stringy bark. So it's this sort of woven nest, and they're sort of in the dark inside the nest. So they will just go straight back in and they don't leave. Whereas with sugar gliders, they can get agitated and they leave. So what we found in some studies, like on squirrel gliders, where that box study I did, where they only had access to the nest boxes, and we had boxes across in sort of a bit of a straight line over, several hundred meters. The interesting thing was that sometimes we'd spend time pulling the gliders out and then tagging them and marking them and then releasing, and then some of them would leave the boxes and then glide away. And then by the time you got to the next set, which is only a couple of hundred meters away, suddenly you've got this tag glider and you check the tag number. And it's like, oh, that's the animal I just did back at, that other site. So yes, the animals do get a bit stressed, but and some of them do leave the boxes, but from what I've seen, they do come back. And like I showed with those studies where we estimated survival rates, because this is an issue that comes up with animal ethics issues, animal ethics committees, what's the impact, blah, blah, blah. You've got to really justify your scientific use of these animals. So I can point to my studies where I've estimated survival rates, and they've got very high survival rates, which are analogous, as I showed, to a study. So that other study where they only had tree hollows was a tree trapping study. So, no difference in survival. So even though you might think animals might leave the boxes when you finish handling them because they're stressed or whatever, there's no evidence that, that's really had an effect.
Yeah, interesting. There's a comment from Colin, which I'm going to sort of twist into a question, mentioning that his group has 70 nest boxes in the national park, and that he can't see how they would get permission from Parks Vic to bore cavities into trees for carved hollows and things like that. Is that something you've had any experience with on public land?
Good question. All I can say is that the study where Murray Ellis first did the study was in Warrumbungles National Park in northern New South Wales. So Murray did work for the Department of the Environment. But certainly, and I guess he was able to convince them because they'd had a major fire, and I guess the trees weren't that old, so he was able to convince them that it was actually going to be positive to the whole using species. So good question. I don't know that, but that just sort of highlights why we might use nest boxes. I know in parks there are issues around putting nails into trees as well. So that does come up as an issue. But I don't know. I think, to be honest, the park managers, well, I've actually had permission. I haven't actually, well, sorry, I'm getting confused. I'm confusing myself here. This was permission to put nest boxes up. So yes, I think if you can convince them, if you're in an area where you can actually argue that there's a deficiency of hollows, and certainly in some of these areas that have become national parks, some of them have had a long history of former use for whatever, whether it's state forest or timber getting or whatever. So they often do have a deficiency of hollows. So you may be able to mount an argument to the land managers that you could do it. That's the only way I could sort of see to approach that.
And I guess for everyone who is in the audience too, there are a whole heap of really interesting points and anecdotes and experiences in the chat, but I won't address all of those. We've got enough time, but yeah, do read through. Really interesting stuff from everyone who's been doing this stuff. Question from Jerry, asking about the depth and the height of boxes. Is there a reason that they're built to specific specs, I suppose, to simulate natural hollows or something like that?
It sort of relates to the point I was making, that the dimensions of the box itself really only need to be sufficient to sort of contain your target species. And obviously you don't want the animal sort of sitting right at the top of the box if it's a box. So you do want a bit of space. I guess, some studies with parrots have shown that they do actually need a certain depth. So some of the parrots have been studied in WA. They have actually identified that there are differences between different parrot species in terms of some needing like a metre depth versus others that may only need half a metre. So generally you want the entrance to be, for the animal to have a bit of space below the entrance itself. And that may also be useful if there are predators around. So there was a nest box study done in Black Mountain in Canberra many years ago. So a woman that was doing a study on crimson rosellas, and she'd put up all these boxes and got a lot of crimson rosellas breeding in there. And then currawongs started sticking their heads in because the entrance size was large enough, and started preying on the chicks and the eggs. So she then had to put a sort of a spout entry on the boxes to prevent them from doing that. So there can be, and this is something in terms of nest box studies and even tree hollow studies, that we don't really know a lot about predation that occurs. But I've certainly, even at home, had issues with carpet pythons getting into nest boxes.
Uh, Colin was asking if you've investigated or had any experience with the Habitek boxes. So off the top of my head, they're sort of the modular,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
long
Yes.
life ones.
So Mick
Yeah,
Callan,
and what your thoughts?
Mick Callan, yeah, Mick Callan that devised those. I looked. I don't want to be too critical. I mean, he's put them out there and done a lot of work with that. There are concerns about sticking lots of plastic out in the forest. Um, I think it's one of those things. Like I've certainly done studies using PVC boxes, which is plastic, obviously. So and certainly some of the box companies have moved away from timber because there are some issues around using timber itself where they've used recycled plastic. So I guess you've got to weigh up the pros and cons of putting plastic out in the forest. But yes, certainly those boxes he designed, because they're sort of modular and you can have insulation built into them because they've sort of got a particular design that you can put in blocks of timber and so on. So I think that there is merit to that. But I guess because I've been doing work with nest boxes over 25 years, I've seen a lot of sort of new ideas come along in terms of I don't want it to sound like reinventing the wheel, but there's a lot of people that have their own ideas about how to design a nest box. And my experience, so yes, there's pros and cons in terms of the material and how you put nest boxes together and what the costs are. But the bottom line really is that the animals are not so picky about the box or the material itself. They're just needing a cavity with the right sort of entrance size, and that maybe it's not going to be accessible to predators. One thing I didn't highlight, which I should, is the issue of how high you install these nest boxes, because a lot of people, and this has certainly happened, like in the when I was collating the data from the road agency studies, because some of their consultant advisors and were basically, I won't go off on a tangent, but basically they were advised to put them as high as they could, and people seem to have that in their mind. But you don't need to put them as high as you can, because then there are safety issues and also cost issues, because then you need a qualified arborist to actually climb a tree to check your boxes. And once boxes are put very high, they tend not to be checked as often as they would otherwise. So I recommend you only need to install them at basically a minimum of 3 meters. Single frame ladder is all you need. And really, we only put them at that height to get them above, so people can't, members of the public can't come in and readily interfere with them. If you look at the studies, or not, yes, if you review the studies on tree hollow use, which I have, you'll find that there's no species where there's clear evidence that they need boxes installed at 10 or 20 meters above the ground. All studies on hollow using species show that the minimum height is often around 5 meters, so 3 to 5 meters. So it varies based on the forest type where you do your study. This was the amazing thing. Dan Harley's work on Leadbeater's possum, he was putting his boxes at 3 meters, and in one period, I think he had like 80% occupancy of his boxes, whereas David Lindenmayer, from his work in the Central Highlands, where the entrance sizes of the possums were a mean of an average of 16 meters above the ground. So that would suggest, you need to put them really high, but you don't.
Yeah, interesting. So many variables. Quick question from Lee. It's probably a long answer in theory, but we'll try and keep it quick. How long do you expect for animals to recover or to even increase post bushfire? Which I'm guessing there's a whole lot of variables in that one.
Yes. I've actually done studies on yellow-bellied gliders post Black Summer. Certainly people have put the idea out there that populations will be decimated and will take more than 10 years to recover. What we found with yellow-bellied gliders was it depended. So I had 3 different landscapes where we did the work, and we had from 50% decline. So these landscapes, I'd actually started setting up the work before the fire. So all of these sites were actually occupied by yellow-bellied gliders prior to the fire. So we knew they were occupied sites, so we could follow them up after the fire. So about at least a 50% decline, and even higher in some areas where where it was a higher intensity burn. So I don't know the exact answer for that, but certainly with yellow-bellied gliders, because of the longer term work I've done with them, they have very low rates of reproduction, like with graded gliders. So they're going to be slower to recover. Whereas some other work I've seen on sugar gliders suggests that, and I should highlight also that a lot of these sites were also drought affected. So a lot of the post-fire studies haven't considered that what they're really looking at is both a drought effect as well as a fire effect. And from my work, the drought could possibly account for at least 50% of the decline. So I've done work on yellow-bellied gliders in an area that were affected by the drought in northeast New South Wales that wasn't affected by the fire. And I documented a 48% decline after 2019, and it took 2 to 3 years for that population to recover to pre-drought levels. So yes, I think with the smaller gliders, and as I showed with that work on the Phascogale, they will be affected by a drought. So in terms of trying to turn this around to, say, fire effects, it's a bit hard to say. It could be 5 to 10 years, but I should also highlight that a lot of people got motivated after fires to put nest boxes up, and I got involved with a project on the north coast of New South Wales, and I kept saying to people, we need to do an audit of the natural tree hollows because I'm not convinced that there's going to be a deficiency. And when we went into these areas, there was still a lot of tree hollows there. So that study was sort of focused on squirrel gliders and to a lesser extent yellow-bellied gliders, but there were a lot of hollows. Not to say that hollows weren't removed. Hollows that had been used by barking owls had actually been destroyed at a number of sites. So yes, it's a complicated scenario, I guess, and we don't know, the full answer to that.
Yeah. Janet was wondering if you've had any experience, any thoughts, recommendations for pole cameras, any particular models or brands, if you've used them and had good experiences?
Not really. My students have tended to use those. I haven't, because most of my studies have involved climbing the trees and catching the animals. I should point out with the Bendigo one that when we check the boxes, we're on a ladder, but then because the boxes are on large nails, we can then lift them down to the ground and then just catch the animals from the boxes on the ground. So it's not sort of dangerous from that point of view. But I also, in other projects, I use harnesses, because sometimes it's just not, it doesn't work to remove the box from the tree. But yes, in terms of pole cameras, there are a few designs. I've only used 1 or 2, and I know that some of them, they do vary a bit in quality. So I can't give you a recommendation there because I haven't done enough with those. Someone like
That's
William
right.
Terry, who has used a few different types, he may be able to answer that question.
I've just replied to your comment, Janet, with the brand that we use, which we find quite good, the Arbocam. But yeah,
Oh,
shop
Chris, I
around.
mean, part of it is sort of the display also, what you're looking at. If you've got a good
Mm.
display, like the people from Hollow Log Homes in Queensland who we purchased a lot of our boxes from, they were doing projects where they were monitoring boxes. And Alan Franks actually had this design where he had um, he ended up using, I don't know if he ended up using his mobile phone attached to a pole, and then he had a little screen so he could Bluetooth to a screen on the ground. And because of it might have been an iPhone he was using, really good quality images. So he could do it that way. So they used 2 poles. So one person had a pole to open the nest box lid, the other one shone the iPhone in there, and then with the console on the ground, they could look at it to see what was in there, and then just take photos if they needed to. And I was really impressed by the quality of those photos, because the pole cameras I used, one of the issues was the graininess of the images.
Yeah, I think it's an issue particularly if you're in an area that might have sugar gliders and squirrel gliders. Trying to differentiate those on a grainy picture is pretty
It's difficult. It's
pretty
very
frustrating.
difficult.
Yeah. Lincoln asked a very interesting question. I guess your thoughts on the restoration of sugar gliders and phascogales in a forest could have sort of some flow-on ecological cascades. Using the wolves in Yellowstone as an example of that, I suppose.
Possibly, and I mean, I'm wondering whether you're sort of referring to the fact that these animals may also prey on birds or nestlings. So yeah, the answer is there's a couple of answers, a couple of lines of thought, and we don't know exactly. I think there can be positive benefits because how can I put this in the right sort of context? I mean, the information about gliders preying on eggs and chicks has come to light in the last 10 years. But predominantly the studies that have been done in mainland Australia as opposed to Tasmania, where they've done dietary studies, and we've done this also with squirrel gliders, that we have detected squirrel gliders taking eggs occasionally, but they were eggs of from a cup nest. They weren't actually within hives. But I guess the key thing is that predominantly the diets are exudates and also insects, arthropods. The studies still need to be done to see if there is an impact on bird populations, but I'm not convinced that that's going to be a strong effect. And phascogales are primarily insectivorous, even though they will take vertebrates, and they line their nests with feathers. The feathers, I don't believe, are prey items. We've actually had one nest that was full of powerful owl feathers. So I don't see a phascogale taking out a phascogale to pluck a few feathers out of it. So from time to time, they will take birds, but I think the positive benefits from those species. So many years ago, Andrew Smith, who did his PhD on sugar gliders and leadbeater's possums in Victoria, he was arguing that having sugar gliders in ecosystems is beneficial because they spend a lot of time preying on phytophagia, so leaf-eating insects, so beetles and things. And this is something I wanted to look at many years ago, but it just never got any funding to do it. So by bringing these animals and populations, increasing these populations in the forest, these animals are actually providing ecosystem services. So they're actually reducing the abundances of those leaf-eating insects, which should benefit the trees. And also both of them, particularly the gliders, are actually also pollinators. Phascogales will spend a lot of time feeding on nectar, eucalypt nectar, and other nectar of other species, Banksias, whereas sugar gliders, it's work I did in the 80s and early 90s was documenting non-flying mammals as pollinators, which included sugar gliders. So we provided definitive evidence of sugar gliders as pollinators of Banksias, but a lot of people overlook that, and they don't seem to realise that these animals are really important pollinators. This might be controversial to some people, but the sugar gliders are probably as important as pollinators of the eucalypts in these forests as what honeyeaters are. Some of the work we did with Banksias showed that the honeyeaters weren't actually very effective pollinators. But I'll put that aside. That's going off on a tangent. But there is strong evidence around that.
All right, there are 3 more questions in the chat, so we're going to try and race through these because we're already over. From Christine, could there be more than one female within a 15-hectare area? I'm assuming this is referring to phascogales. If there are a number of nest boxes in that area, is that feasible, plausible?
There could be, and what's been documented by Todd Soderquist is that the female phascogales can live for more than 2 years. So when we're actually pulling these animals out of the box, you can actually sort of roughly age them based on the size of the teats. So when you're looking at what's in the boxes, there's going to be first-year females about to breed, as well as second-year females. So what Todd identified was that he was radio tracking. So you will get mother-daughter pairings. So they will be tolerant of each other within adjoining territories. So you will get overlap by those individuals. And we certainly had some instances where there seemed to be an association between a second year and a first year female before the breeding period, and then that we didn't tag our animals, so we couldn't be definitive, but certainly in terms of the boxes. But you do notice as you're checking the boxes that there is quite regular spacing of the Phascogales. The males are not territorial, so you will get all sorts of overlap. So you will get multiple. So in the May period, we've had like up to five Phascogales in the one box. So a couple of females and maybe three males. But typically what you find is once the females have got the young in October, it's just one female every couple of 100 meters. So I think that holds more so than with the sugar gliders. With sugar gliders, it's a bit more complicated, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Question from Catherine about carved hollows, and if you know whether it matters what types of tree, what tree species they're in, and she's specifically thinking of some non-native trees in the yard.
Okay, I don't think it particularly matters, because if the area that you're in is deficient in hollows, they're going to those animals are going to use those whatever hollows you provide. So whether it's a carved hollow or not. So if you're putting it into an exotic species, I think they will use them anyway. So I mean, we've been surprised with some of the other work that we've done. People sort of think that if you've got, say, eucalypt forest surrounded by pine forest, that things like gliders won't move through the pine forest. But certainly they won't find any food in the pine forest, but they will disperse through the pine forest. So, we've sort of documented that to some extent with yellow-bellied gliders, and David Lindenmeyer's team's documented that with greater gliders. So yes, putting hollows into exotic species, if you do have the hollow using species around, then it's quite likely that they will use those. But they will need some native species to derive food from.
Yeah. Oh, great. And I'm going to combine a couple of questions here around predators and feral predators. In terms of placing a box, how much thought goes into making it difficult for a cat or a fox to potentially access, and what approaches are there to avoid this?
Good question. So to put that into context, there was a study done in northern New South Wales on koalas, where they put out they were putting out what they ended up calling blinky drinkers. So these little sort of drinking containers in an area where where it was getting quite hot over the summer, and they were recording use of these troughs by koalas, and they were stunned when they found that foxes were climbing up to them. But those things that they were installing were only a couple of meters above the ground, and as far as I could tell, the trees tended to have forks in them. So, people are concerned that, foxes can climb trees. I think there's a limit, and they will be facilitated by branches and forks in trees and so on. Whereas in terms of cats, and the same sort of principle applies. So some work following on from Dan Harley's work at Yellingbo with the nest boxes there. So his were installed at about 3 meters, and then when they put up cameras in the last 5 or so years, they started getting records of feral cats sitting on top of the nest boxes. Again, I think there's a limit to how high a cat can climb in a tree. So if there is concern that there are feral cats there, then you would need to put them higher. But I think, and I'm not sure, I haven't been to Yellingbo, so I'm not sure whether those, whether the cats were facilitated to climb up to 3 meters, or whether they were on sort of lower level nest boxes that might have been at 2 meters. But certainly that comes into the equation when you think about the minimum height that you're going to put your boxes at. Certainly the work we did in Brisbane, where we were always concerned that because we're in an urban area, there were house cats, and we had boxes installed at 3 or so meters and we had cameras up, we never got any records of cats on or near the boxes in that area. So I think it's a little bit overplayed, but it's another one of these things where I would exercise caution and a little bit of common sense. But I think once you're up to sort of 3 to 5 meters, I think 5 meters, I can't really see a cat going up a a straight tree without any cross branches before the box. And certainly if it's smooth bark tree, it's probably going to have more trouble getting up.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we've got there. Thank you so much, Ross, for your time and
No worries,
insights.
Chris.
It's really, really great presentation. And thanks everyone for attending. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for our next webinars. We've got some more exciting ones lined up. So if you haven't done so, subscribe, follow us on socials and all of that. But yeah, thank you all for attending and thank you again, Ross.